So typically we see organizations go through, what I would refer to as kind of a maturity or adoption life cycle. And so at the very early stages of the organization, there's minimal focus on security controls and, things like compliance. Kind of very much a reactive, hey, I'm just building, I know, very early stage, typically, less than 10 employees. I'm not even thinking about security right now. I'm just thinking about, like, how do I get my business off the ground, start building services, start servicing customers, getting some revenue in. Then we start getting to kind of, a baseline level of maturity and this is where a lot of organizations live for a long time. And this is, I might have some basic security policies. I'll have things like anti-malware software. I might be doing things like user education, but I don't really have a broad and holistic program in place, right? And so kind of doing things on a more ad hoc basis. Typically we see organizations, reach this level of maturity, when they have some revenue in the bank. They might be, $1 million or a little bit less than $1 million in revenue. But they're starting to put some basic controls in place just to recognize that they now have a business that needs to be protected. And then we kind of continue to ramp up the maturity life cycle. So, developing and mature organizations, typically are going to start thinking about things in a very risk-centric way. So, there's a lot of different things I can do in security. How do I prioritize that? What are the risks that my business actually faces, and how do I invest in controls, regular testing, strengthening those controls, and then moving on to a standard like a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001. And the reason we're typically using a standard like this is twofold. One is, I tend to think of security compliance standards as best practices, documented, right? So if you think about all the experience of CISOs all over the world and industry experts and stuff like that, all that experience gets distilled down into, standards effectively. And those standards tell us these are the best practices that various different types of organizations should follow, right? So instead of you having to figure that out and reinvent the wheel, if you follow a standard, you're generally going to be following, that distilled set of best practices. So that's one reason. The second reason is, as it relates to ensuring that my customers, my partners, and my investors and others know that I'm holding myself to a good security standard, these standards typically provide attestation or certification. And so by achieving these standards, not only am I following best practices, but I can show and demonstrate that trust to third parties. And so that's a good way for me to grow my business, to take in additional financing, to work with partners like banks and so forth and so on, to prove that I'm trustworthy to do business with, right? So that's where, typically, for small mid-sized organizations, we see a certain level of maturity. And then, as we get even larger, we're managing that standard over multiple years. We might be providing additional standards. So maybe we started with SOC 2, we're adding ISO. And we're typically at this stage starting to make some investments in an internal security team. So, at the maturity stage, we might be working entirely with a company like Cobalt. When we get to late maturity, we might be 250 employees or more. At that point, I can start to justify hiring some internal security resources to complement the external team, right? So, typically when we're reactive baseline developing stages, I just don't have the budget, the resources to hire dedicated security professionals. As I get larger, that budget starts to free up and I can start to bring some internal resources in as well. That being said, it's not typically till an organization is at 1,000 employees or more where they actually can afford to justify like building out an entire security team and a security operations center and all this kind of stuff. And so, you kind of live in that maturity stage for a while before you get to kind of like a true enterprise program where you're doing most things internally.